Okay, all right. So good evening, everybody. Everybody here in person at the History Colorado, and all of you in the comfort of your homes in Zoom land. It's great to have you on this first lecture of the Rocky Mountain Map Society of 2023. I am Angela with Madrid. I'm the president of your society. I'm very excited for this lecture that is open up the year. That shows us that maps are not just a medium to take us from point A to point B, or just they have beauty, they have value because of their beauty. But as we will see, they very important for political events. In fact, literally, they have mapped the course of history. And so we're going to hear a little bit about our speaker later in the introduction. But first, let me thank History of Colorado. It's always great to be here. Sean and Kevin that always give us room to be here for us together. Yes, big applause. For all of you at home, it will be good once the weather gets a little bit better that you can come over here, and it's a beautiful place. And the key thing is that since we're here after 5, you can wander around and check the exhibits for free. No, just kidding. Okay, so first let me introduce our great program manager, Naomi Heiser, that is going to give us a view of what's coming up, and also to introduce our speaker. So Naomi, I'm just going to pass this microphone to you.
Can everybody hear me okay? All right, so we've got a program in March. That's our next one coming up. March 7th, it's our own Susan Schulten from DU speaking on the most recent book that just was published called Emma Willard's Maps of History. Should be very interesting. The book is just out. I don't know if any of you have seen a copy yet, but you should get your hands on one. We may have something in April, and I'll certainly send out a newsletter if that gets confirmed. And then in May, we have Map Month. It's going to return this year in person. It's very exciting. It'll be here at History Colorado in a different room. But we'll let you know about that too. And the theme will be Mapping Historical Denver. So there'll be more information to come. Tonight, we welcome Matthew Mingus to tell us about mapping a defeated Germany in the aftermath of World War II. Dr. Mingus is an associate professor of history at the University of New Mexico, Gallup, where he teaches courses on Western civilization, the Holocaust, and modern European history. He's published articles in several journals, and his first book, called Remapping Modern Germany After National Socialism, 1945 to 1961, was published in 2017. And he served as the book review editor of the Portolan since 2020. The Portolan is Washington Map Society's magazine. His primary research interest remains the history of cartography, and he's currently working on a project that explores the mapping of the Navajo Nation and the use of maps in the American occupation of indigenous land. And I hope, really excited, I hope that you'll come back and speak to us about that when you have some kind of article out and want to give us a talk. Professor Mingus lives in Gallup, New Mexico with his wife, Lindsay, and their 2 sons. And we really appreciate that you were willing to drive, well, you didn't drive, you flew up here, all the way here to Denver to speak to us. So thank you.
Don't roll me too much. Oh, yeah, it's like TSA here.
Yeah.
There you go. And I'm going to switch you to share screen. One. All yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation to be here. I love this hybrid setup. You guys are doing great with that. It's also nice to talk with folks in my own local time zone about maps. That feels really, really good. I'm going to stick to a script here, and I apologize for doing that. As I've spent more time in the classroom, I've been a little disturbed at how much I've begun to reflect the stereotype of the tangent-loving, unfocused, like wildly gesticulating professor. And I don't want to drone on too much here. Also, I'm going to show you a bunch of maps. And after I show you these maps, I'll put my email up at the end. So if you want to see any of these maps in more detail, you'd like the image, all of it's in the public domain, all of it's accessible to you, just send me an email and I will send it out to you. Let me drink water first. I want to begin with something of a familiar story. It's June 1945. In April, just a few months prior, the Soviets successfully invaded Berlin and Adolf Hitler committed suicide. In early May of 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered to the Allied powers. But only now, only in June 1945, has the Nazi government been completely dissolved and handed over to the Allies. The Cold War, which of course existed rhetorically, even during the war between the Soviets and their American, British, and French counterparts, that Cold War only now really begins to grow legs and make itself manifest on the European continent. Germany will serve as the initial focal point and make it, as the initial focal point of this conflict, and its remapping after its defeat plays a larger role in both German history and the growing animosity between the Western Allies and the Soviets than I think many historians admit. But I'm biased because I love maps, and I know you all love maps too. So I want to use my time here tonight to really talk about the cartographic strategies of three different types of cartographers in Germany after the Second World War. I want to talk about government agencies, I want to talk about educators, and at the end of this talk, I want to talk about public relations firms and how these three different types of cartographies contributed to the new identity of Germany after the Second World War, after its defeat. By the mid-20th century, all of these institutions had mapped conquered peoples before, as any historian of empire or imperialism can attest to. What's so unique about the remapping of Germany was that Germany, of course, had helped to professionalize map-making itself and establish cartography and geography as academic disciplines. I'm sure that some of you are familiar with names like Karl Ritter, Alexander von Humboldt, Albrecht Penck, and Friedrich Ratzel. I think that the Allied powers realized this, or at least that the geographers and cartographers working for the Allied governments and militaries realized this. German academia had been obsessed for over a century by the point of Nazi defeat with mapping itself in accordance with modern processes that German geographers had often themselves invented. And then they exported that discipline to the rest of the Western world, including, of course, the United States, where most of the early geography professors in the United States either were trained in Germany or had German professors who taught them. The Allies then often needed to rely on the students of these men up here on the screen. Those are, well, the students of these men, those are the German cartographic and geographic experts, many of whom had been supportive of Hitler and National Socialism. But the Allies needed these often Nazi German experts to denazify and remap their own defeated nation state with the tools and strategies pioneered by their earlier German professors. This is why I love it. It's like super fun. I love this topic. Now, there'd been quite a lot of confusion during the war about which Allied power would control which part of Germany once Germany had been conquered. President Roosevelt, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, President Roosevelt was very fond of drawing kind of off-the-cuff maps of what he envisioned a new Germany would look like. Here's one of those maps. He drew this, I think, on the way to the Tehran conference on a map, a National Geographic Society map. He just pulled out a pencil and kind of drew out what he wanted to see. Maps like these reflect FDR's interest in cartography, and that's well noted by historians, his interest in cartography. But maps like this also drove his State and War Department officials absolutely nuts because he would submit all kinds of different versions to them. At various points in the war, FDR argued for splitting Germany into 3 states. He argued for splitting it into 5 states with 2 internationalized zones. This is that map here. You can see he's got, I think, Hanover, Prussia, Saxony, Hessen, and Bavaria. And you have 2 international zones, one, of course, being the Saar region. He also proposed splitting Germany up into 7 different states. Oh, thanks. I'll use the clicker. You can see these. Good. He also proposed splitting it up into 7 different states, like getting rid of the internationalized zones and just having those be their own separate states. During negotiations over this in 1944, there's this great episode when, after the British and Soviets submit their potential plans for post-war German occupation zones, FDR frantically writes to his State Department and says, "Hey, I need my plan. Where's my plan?" the State Department has no idea what plan he's talking about because he submitted so many. So they write to the War Department and they say, hey, where's FDR's plan? We need the plan for occupation zones. The War Department says, we have no idea what you're talking about. So what the War Department does is they just submit the most recent map that FDR has proposed to them. The State Department gets this map and it's absolutely nuts. This map, this plan would have ceded to the Americans a massive northwestern zone of Germany, which would have included 51% of the German population and 46% of German territory. It only allocated 22% of that German territory to the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union, which had expended enormous resources and manpower in defeating the Nazis, were never going to be okay with just a fifth of Germany's land. The State Department knew this. So they asked the War Department, like, where did this come from? And the War Department says, from the president, this is what we have. So it's a total kind of negotiating disaster. Eventually, the State Department was able to convince FDR to adopt a territorial agreement proposed jointly by the Soviets and the British in February 1944. In this proposal, each ally would receive roughly 1/3 of Germany's land, 1/3 of Germany's population, and 1/3 of Germany's resources. It would be split into a northwestern zone, a southwestern zone, and an eastern zone. And you can see, even though this map is a little bit altered from the initial one, you can see those zones and where they're sort of forming on this map here. This would only change in February 1945 over the protests of Roosevelt, when France was allocated small zones of occupation, right? One in southwestern Germany, and then they're also given a section of Berlin. In any case, by early 1944, the lines of occupation are roughly drawn. FDR, though, was still not happy. It was not clear which occupational powers would control which occupation zones, and he demanded that the Americans be given control over the northwestern zone. That's what he really wanted, in no small part because of its access to the sea. In 1944, the United States is still heavily involved in the war in the Pacific against the Japanese. Americans really care about that war because of Pearl Harbor, so he says it makes the most sense that we should have the most access to the sea. For FDR too, he saw France, Italy, and the Balkans, and the kind of the chaos in that region after the war, as a British problem. It was a European problem. So the British should go ahead and have the southwestern zone. Churchill is not going to agree to this. I mean, Britain is literally right across the water from Germany. They want that northwestern zone. So throughout the early half of 1944, the eastern zone is constantly referred to by all sides as the Soviet zone, where the other two are just ambiguously labeled. It's like the northwestern zone and the southwestern zone. It's not clear which power is going to control each of those zones. This deadlock is only broken when in June 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower successfully invaded the beaches of Normandy in Operation Overlord and planned a broader invasion of Western Europe. Eisenhower made it clear that he was going to undertake this invasion in accordance with an earlier proposal called the Ronkin Plan. This is a plan that the Americans, British, and the Soviets had agreed on at the First Quebec Conference in August 1943. That plan called for an American invasion and occupation of southwestern Germany, a British invasion and occupation of northwestern Germany, and a Soviet invasion and occupation of eastern Germany. And it has a lot more to do with where everybody's resources were. It's very pragmatic. The Americans are coming in through the south, the British, again, are right across the sea coming in from the north, and then the Soviets are coming in from the east. Roosevelt did not interfere with Eisenhower's plan, although he did demand that the American military be given territorial access to the North Sea. That was his kind of compromise. And so what ended up happening was that the British said, this is reasonable. And they decided to give the Americans control over the territories of Bremen and Bremerhaven. And you can see that up on the map. We have this tiny little American enclave that is on the sea, so that the Americans had access to it. So this is our post-war Germany. And as of June 5th, 1945, each ally gets complete control of its respective zone. On that same day, the United States and Britain handed over the German states of Saxony, Thuringia, and Mecklenburg, territories that they had invaded during the war. They handed those over to the Soviets. In exchange, the Soviets turned over chunks of Berlin to the United States, Britain, and France. So that was sort of the deal. It was a land swap for occupational space. Because the Cold War was, as all the hip historians say, heating up during this time, each victorious power rushed to secure any and all potentially important individuals and resources that its military had come into contact with. Some of those important resources and individuals were, obviously enough, maps and their makers. To offer one example of this post-war scramble, on June 28th, nearly a month after the United States had formally ceded the German state of Thuringia to the Soviet Union, a Captain Lloyd D. Black and a lieutenant named Thomas R. Smith drove into the small town of Vorbis in Thuringia to collect the prominent German geographer Emil Minen and the 34 staff members of his Abteilung für Landeskunde, or it's the Department of Regional Studies. This was a department within the larger Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme, or the Reich's Office of State Survey. There's these 6 different departments within it, and Minen was the head of the Department of Regional Studies. He had founded this department in 1941 under the Nazi regime. So the Allies are very interested, or the Americans are very interested in picking him up, since soon he will become a Soviet resource instead of an American resource. There are a lot of map-making agencies in Germany. It was a modern nation state that was very interested in cartography and geography. I know it's going to be really hard to see on this. This is a mapping out of all of these survey institutions and map-making agencies within the German government. This is an OSS document that was produced during the war so that they would know where to try to go and who to try to pick up. So it's a really important, got my clicker here. The Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme is this institution here with its various departments inside of it. It controls basically all of the surveying, the map making that's going on in Nazi Germany, especially if it's not military related, although it also has ties to the military. From all accounts, this evacuation was a terrible and rushed experience. All furniture was left behind. A great deal of outdated and unimportant cartographic material was abandoned. And in every single document I've read from people who experienced this evacuation, they always mention that it like poured. It was pouring down rain the entire day that they're being evacuated. As the Abteilung staff would later recount, Black and Smith had retrieved them in the nick of time. The Soviets had already lined the roads in and out of Vorbis with red banners, just as they had done at many of the towns and cities that they sort of liberated through performative marching parade. So Vorbis was the next day taken over by the Soviets. Minen would go on to become a close collaborator of the American occupation. He supervised the creation of post-war German maps for the Americans. In the spring of 1946, however, he made a pretty big mistake. He decided on his own that he was going to go retrieve some cartographic data and maps from a hidden cache of material at a monastery in the Bavarian town of Otterborn. Without mentioning this trip to his supervisors in the military government, or he didn't mention anything to them, Minen took those materials from the monastery back to his Abteilung. When the Americans discovered this, they started to take a harder look at Minen and his staff. It turned out that several of the Abteilung's employees, including Minen himself, had some relatively close connections to the Nazi military's Special Research Unit, which had produced maps and geographic research for the Nazi military in occupied parts of Europe. And in fact, during the war, Minen had helped to supervise on the Eastern Front some of the colonization of Poland. Like he'd helped to map that out and plot out how settlement could occur in parts of Poland. The Americans also discovered, after some investigation, that Minen had provided an OSS report detailing the cartographic holdings of a hidden archive in Stassfurt, that's a city in the Soviet zone, to some of his colleagues in East Berlin. So he was taking American documents and sending it to East Berliners, which was not cool with the American government. These lapses of judgment were seen by the Americans as potentially subversive. So Minen was arrested in August 1946. He would spend nearly a year interned at what the Americans called Camp Dustbin. Oh, give me a second. I'm not used to the altitude. This air's so dry. Dustbin was physically located at the Konsberg Castle. This was an old fortress in the Taunus Mountains, north of the spa town Wiesbaden, in the western German state of Hesse. Konsberg had been the headquarters of Hermann Goering during the Third Reich, but now after the war, it served as an interrogation center, and it served a kind of dual purpose. There were two camps, as the military called them, at Konsberg. There was Camp Dustbin, which Emil Minen was taken to. That was a camp for technical experts, scientists, academics. Then there was also a camp called Ashcan, which was for like lower level politicians, people who served directly in the Nazi government. The two primary interrogators assigned to Emil Minen were Major Edmund Tilley of British intelligence and a Mr. Walter N. Bailey from the US State Department. And often we see this pairing. You'll have like a British intelligence officer and an American State Department officer doing the interrogations together. While I can find very little information about Walter Bailey, Tilley was an experienced interrogator who had native German fluency. His father had been an English teacher in Germany, so he was actually born and raised in Germany. And he was noted by his superiors for his ability to really nail different dialects of German, because he'd spent so much time in different parts of Germany. The reports produced from Minen's interrogations, as well as Minen's personal correspondence during this period of time, make clear his frustration with the situation. He believed that he had proven his value and commitment to the Allied occupation since the end of the war. He had, after all, been employed by the American military government. He had cooperated in producing and disseminating cartographic material to service the American occupation of Germany. He defended his actions in Autobahn, arguing that he was simply trying to protect cartographic material that could potentially be used in his work with the military government. Regardless, Minen's detention was only terminated without prejudice on May 9th, 1947, so he spent about a year in internment. And it's interesting because during that internment, he was still expected to work for the American military, and he continued to maintain a close relationship with the Abteilung. He had been removed temporarily as its director, but he was still like working with them constantly, especially through correspondence. He produced several lists for his interrogators, often with the help of the Abteilung, lists of cartographic material hidden during the war and the places that he or other German geographers believed those materials might still remain. This is an example of some of those lists. You just see at the top, like they have the interrogator's name, they explain their subject is Emil Minen, and then they start to say, you know, these are the hiding places of scientific materials that Minen knows of. This is where we think certain pieces of material are. He also created lists of aerial photographs taken during the war. He created lists of every research group and institution remotely related to spatial policy, and lists of what happened to those groups and institutions after the demise of the Third Reich. And here's an example of that list. You have sort of kind of an idea of what happened to each of these individuals or organizations after the war. Correspondence with colleagues had always been an important part of Minen's personal life and academic career, but it became truly essential while he was interned. There's a funny story where his wife, she had heard that there was a really good shoe repairman near Konsberg, and sometimes they were allowed to go into town. And so she sent him some of his old shoes, but she wrapped them, like the package, in newspaper from the Third Reich. So he got in trouble because his wife was sending him like Nazi materials in the mail. Like he really had to explain, like, no, she doesn't understand. It's clearly packaging. They actually have an interrogation where they talk about that with him to make sure that he hasn't, you know, developed any sympathies or doesn't have any leftover sympathies for the Nazis. To try to cheer him up around Christmas of 1946, his colleagues from the Abteilung sent him a phenomenal hand-drawn map that outlined his career, accomplishments, and challenges up until his internment. This is one of my absolute favorite maps that I found in an archive. I hadn't looked at it for a few years before including it in this presentation, but I love it so much that in the Portolan, there's going to be an article coming up about this map. Like it's such a fascinating map. The map, all of which is written in Latin, or at times a hybrid of German and Latin, depicts, the title says, the amazing journey into the terrible Dustbin regions. Created in 1946, the journey is by the most famous and celebrated cartographer, Emilius Mininius Coloniensis. The Latin always gets me there. The Coloniensis at the end is almost certainly a reference to where he was born and raised in Cologne. The map was drawn by Erich Kluge, one of the Abteilung's in-house cartographers, and one of the people who was evacuated in June 1945 with Minen from Vorbis. The idea for the map is credited to Josef Goetz, a technical assistant at the Abteilung who was also a fellow June 1945 evacuee. There's all kinds of great stuff about this map, and I'm not going to talk about it in super detail, but I do want to give you some of the fun things on here. There's the Ivory Tower of Illusion, and again, this is all in Latin. There's the Ivory Tower of Illusion, which I like to point out to my academic friends. There's a citadel of ash or dustbin, which of course is a reference to the Konsberg Castle. And if you look down here at what little legend there is, there's these solid lines are the places he's been, and then you have a sort of dashed line of the places that he will go. And so he's gone through all of this stuff. He's stuck at this port of liberation where he'll hopefully be able to sail back to happy Bavaria and Scheinfeld, where his Abteilung was. There are mountains here named after his interrogators. There's like a Bailey Mountain and a Tilly Mountain. There's a Bay of Separation, a Sea of Impatience, keeping Minen from his friends and family, a Cape of Captivity. That makes sense, really sad. There's a lot going on here. There are these islands down here, which these things are like, you know, Captain Black. There's other things like family, like happiness, all of that. He can't reach any of that because those are far away from him. Again, I just recently completed an article for the portal, and I'm pretty excited about this map. It's really fun, and I couldn't find anywhere else to include it, so I figured I'd write something for them. Minen's colleagues also sent along a poem written in Latin with this map that consoled him, and it told them they were hoping, you know, he would meet a speedy recovery or not recovery, but reunion with them. After he was released from his internment in May 1947, Minen continued to work for the American occupational power. He began surreptitiously compiling information on his German colleagues for the American State Department, and he did this in a really incredible way. When he founded the Abteilung, he also created a journal called the Berichte zur deutschen Landeskunde, or the Report on German Regional Studies. And over time, this became a pretty well-known circular in German academic circles. It's where people published, it's where people wrote about what they had published. They told, you know, of job changes or even moving like from one place to another with their families. It was a place to kind of keep up with other academics in your field. Now, obviously, by the end of the war, this had been discontinued. There weren't resources to publish this. So he revives it now after his internment. With the financial backing of his American patrons, he was able to send this out for free to all German universities. And this is happening, of course, before like Facebook and Twitter. You guys look more like a Snapchat, TikTok crowd. But before any of that, this is really how people kept up with each other, right? This is how you knew where everybody was and what people were working on. So all of these German geographers start submitting all of their personal information and all of their academic information to Minen. Minen then dutifully puts all that stuff in his Berichte, but he sends along everything they send, all of their letters. He just immediately forwards as well to the American State Department, right? And he does this as part of his work for that American State Department. I could talk about Minen and his collaboration with both the Nazis and the Americans all day long. There's a brilliant book that you should all check out from your local library. No, I'm sorry, my publisher says you should buy it. You should buy it. No, I don't really care. But if you're interested more in that, you should totally check that book out from your library. Other collaborators necessary for the denazification and remapping of German space and territory were school textbook authors. And that's the next thing I really want to focus on here, educators. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the Soviets almost instantly began redrafting German textbooks for students in their occupation zone. They're unique, though, in the sense that they have no interest in Nazi-era textbooks, and they have no interest in Weimar-era textbooks, the democratic government before the Nazi era. Both of those things are antithetical to Marxism for the Soviets. So they want to create something sort of new. The Americans, British, and French, on the other hand, simply reprinted pre-Nazi geography textbooks with some modifications that I'll talk about in a second. For example, From 1945 to 1949, the British zone reproduced Robert Fox's 1931 edition of Geography Lessons for Secondary Schools. As you might expect from a geography textbook, Fox and his collaborators had regularly used maps prior to the Third Reich to address issues such as ethnic German enclaves living outside of Germany. Here's an example of that here. You can see we have a northern part of northern Italy where there's a lot of German speakers. So Fox includes this in his textbook. Fox's book also used maps to show the historical shifting of borders on the margins of German territory, like this map here, where you see the shifting of the border between Germany and Denmark. I mean, it's a geography textbook. He's obviously going to want to include maps. Rather than reproduce those maps, though, the British chose to completely remove them and all maps of Germans or of Germany from their initial run of this geography textbook's post-war reprint. Similarly, right after the war, the Americans quickly produced a series of small 30-page pamphlets for geography courses taking place in their respective zone of occupation. These also lacked any kind of mapped Germany or any maps at all, for that matter. Again, in geography courses, you have geography textbooks, which are not going to include maps. And I think that shows they're nervous about how to present Germany after the Second World War. It's important to them. They want to do it deliberately, so they just completely ignore it for the time being after the war. Instead, they produced this series. It's basically a collection of excerpts from poems and travel logs dealing with specific territories. They cover topics like the Swabian Alps, Upper Swabia, and the Neckarland. By 1947, it would be the French who would actually begin to publish geography textbooks with maps. But the maps of Germany they included often had some pretty ambiguous borders and some pretty not ambiguous borders. Let me show you an example here. I love this. They're just like, we don't know how we're going to represent the Oder-Neisse line, the line between Poland and Germany. We're not totally sure how we're going to present that yet. Although that boundary with France is real clear. Like, that's very solid and obvious there. The author of this textbook, Max Nobbs, openly acknowledged the cartographic shortcomings of his publication, encouraging students to find maps to use, especially from contemporary newspapers, alongside the text. And you see that a lot, where they'll say, hey, go find your local newspaper and see if it has a map that can help you while you work through this part of the book. By 1949, of course, Germany had been formally split into two. You have the Federal Republic of Germany in the west and the German Democratic Republic in the east. The geography textbooks published throughout the 1950s reflected the geopolitical problems of this era. As it became more and more clear over time that German reunification was not going to occur anytime soon, as many of the Allies had hoped, textbook maps began to change their depiction of Germany's intrastate border between East and West from something potentially permeable to something that was a more permanent characteristic of their national cartography. One series, Emil Hinrichs' Geography in the 5th and 6th school year, which was originally released in 1949, was used extensively in the British zone and included few maps depicting nation states. The maps the book does include, such as this world map, heavily downplayed borders. This is, I think, the only map in that textbook. And it has physical characteristics. There's some rivers, right? You can see clearly the continents, but there's no interest in producing any nation states on this map. The 1950 edition of this same text, though, replaces this map of the world with a map of Germany, a map that shows Germany's 1937 borders, so before Germany really started to expand. It shows those borders, too, as kind of perforated and potentially malleable. This same map was reproduced in this series through 1956. So through 1956, this is what school children in German schools in the British occupation zone are seeing as the map of Germany. Only in 1957 has the textbook substantially changed. If you look at this slide, you'll see those same 1937 German boundaries, but also the intra-German border. The western part of Germany has been appropriately labeled as the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, but the east has been given the title Soviet Zone. It's a clear nod to the potential still for its absorption into the West, and I think Most obviously, it's the Federal Republic's rejection of the East's sovereignty. They don't want to acknowledge that the East is its own country. In fact, the final sentence of this textbook is, quote, "All Germans hope that the day of reunification comes soon," end quote. That's how the geography textbook in the British zone ends. One of the American zone's most important geography textbook publications was the Geography World Studies Teaching and Workbook for German School series, written by Ernst Karl and Franz Schneider. In its earliest form, from 1949 through 1952, no national maps of Germany are included. There just are no national maps of Germany up through 1952. But in 1953, the West Germans published a volume in this series that specifically focused on German geography. So there you have to kind of create some national rendition cartographically of Germany. They even went so far as to include linguistic maps in this of German speakers throughout Central Europe. I'll show you this slide. Note though, so this is linguistic maps of Germany over time. Note though that in this post-war textbook, these are maps long ago. Like this is from the 9th century here on the left, and this is about this is a linguistic map from the 15th century on the right. So they don't mind doing that at this point, as long as it's nothing contemporary. This is long in the past. In this same edition's national map of Germany, which you can see here, this is the national map it produced, the 1937 borders are included, with the easternmost territories labeled as being under foreign administration, which is a really weird way of talking about new Polish territory in 1953, right? We're almost 10 years out of the war, and this geography textbook is still saying that these territories over here, which were ceded to Poland, are under foreign administration. In this map, then, the textbook shows a Germany which is simultaneously preserved in its 1937 form, but seemingly temporarily divided. This same cartographic proposition is reiterated in 1958, albeit in more detail, when the editors of the volume were swapped from Karl and Schneider to Gustav Koitsa and Edward Moltema. The text itself also delves more deeply into the problems of Germany's division. While the earlier Karl and Schneider version of the book that included this map, while the earlier version of this book makes clear Germany's natural predisposition to link Europe together through trade. That was a really big emphasis in the book. The Koitsa and Moltema edition really emphasizes how Germany's political divisions could cause the nation's economy to collapse, thereby launching the entire continent of Europe and potentially the world into disaster. They write at the end of the book, therefore, quote, "It is the fateful mission of the German people to realize their reunification as an economic and political community for the benefit of the European community of nations and for all of humanity," end quote. Like that's some serious drama, that all of humanity is sort of counting on Germany to reunify. The final textbook series I want to discuss is another one initially from the American zone of occupation. This is going to be Heinrich Barton's Countries and Peoples Geography Lesson Volume 5, and it's about Germany. It's called The Center of Europe. It was originally published in 1951. I think this textbook is an excellent example of how, as the 1950s dragged on, West German map makers really struggled with how to represent the division between East and West Germany. In the 1951 edition, Barton depicts a national Germany with its 1937 boundaries, but with several different types of German expellees, including those living in the Ost zone, the East zone, who are weirdly ghost-like, right? Then you have these other types of Germans around them. It also kind of strangely includes Sudeten Germans down here. So Germans who are living in the Sudetenland, which of course was invaded by Hitler, and he used the justification that Germans lived there. Now we're seeing that in this 1951 post-war map. The 1956 edition eliminates the, excuse me. This is the 1954 edition. Barton replaced this 1951 edition with this one in 1954. Yeah. You can see here there's no distinction anymore between the different Germans, but there is a clear distinction between the West and the East, with this exception of Berlin. But the Germans themselves are now all the same, and there are no more Germans outside of this sort of island map of Germany. The 1956 edition eliminates the cartographic distinction between East and West. As in the 1954 edition, there are no more territorial claims to those lands east of the new German-Polish border. While the East-West distinction here is not clearly marked, other maps of West Germany in this very same 1956 edition were being produced and leaving East Germany off the map entirely. Here's my favorite. It's a map of beer output in West Germany. But you can see we're sort of moving from this 1951 to this in 1954 to 56. And then this also is in 1956. As I've seen in other cartographic mediums from this time period, and as you've seen in the several depictions of German territory in these different textbooks, West Germany deeply struggled throughout the 1950s with how to adequately represent the East on its maps. Almost always, the text of these geography school books consistently implores their German readers to consider the interconnectedness of Germans and the broader interconnectedness of European nation states. But the maps consistently fail to represent that position, nearly always instead producing these types of island maps where you don't see interconnectedness between European states, where a German nation state is portrayed as cartographically sequestered. So that's education. The trouble of creating clear maps was not lost on the governments of the two Germanys. And while East Germany's map space would be dictated by a centralized communist government, the West would instead turn to the free market. Where textbooks and academics offered nuance, disagreement, and multiple perspectives of West Germany's mapped space, corporate firms, if you paid them enough, could offer simple, clear articulations of the Germanies. By the 1950s, in fact, public relations firms, especially in the US, were really beginning to come into their own. As the Cold War continued to heat up, love that phrase, and as West Germany continued to rely on its American ally, convincing Americans that the West Germans were worth supporting became really, really important throughout the 1950s. In 1952, the West German government hired the Roy Bernard Company, it's an American company, to represent the Federal Republic of Germany as public relations counsel in all matters falling within the general area of public relations that should be considered by the government of the Federal Republic of Germany conducive to the promotion of harmony, understanding, industrial and cultural intercourse, and tourism between the Federal Republic of Germany and the United States. That is a sentence. We got some lawyers and government workers in here. I'm sure you understood that. I think at least, well, maps, of course, would be a vital matter included in this agreement. In fact, one of the founding members of the Roy Bernard Company, a man named Bernard Gittleson, he's the Bernard of Roy Bernard, he lamented in mid-1955 the sorry condition of German maps in the United States, most of which he claimed were either too old or too complicated. He complained, too, that even top US newspapers carry maps that were copyrighted in 1928 or 1933, and he's not wrong. That was the case. One of the first projects the Roy Bernard Company recommended producing then was a new map of Germany envisioned by its consultants as a simple map designed to do a very big public relations job, namely to show the present size of the Federal Republic of Germany and how it has been divided and where the important areas are. It would frankly be a map created to provoke American sympathy and business. The Federal Republic sent the Roy Bernard Company a map that they thought was pretty good and they would like to see reproduced for an American audience. By May of 1956, the Roy Bernard Company had made sure that more than 10,000 American schools and libraries received this finished version of that map. The first edition sold out within a month. It was one of the only maps produced since the collapse of the Third Reich to depict all of Germany's national territory in one single, easy-to-read sheet. Moreover, the Roy Bernard Company ensured that the German press covered the map's dissemination as an objective rendering of a divided Germany. That is, a map that made Germany's cartographic situation a bit more urgent to the typical American. After all, wrote one German newspaper, quote, "It makes a difference whether one happens to hear about the division of Germany or whether one sees it," end quote. Surrounding the map here are emblems of the German states, and it's interesting because they include like Pomerania and Silesia and Berlin. Like they include all of the map, the emblems of the German states, which implied not only their existence, but also their autonomy and importance, although none, of course, is as large and bold as the national crest in the middle. The most glaring symbols here, frankly, are the lines dividing Germany, and that was by design. When this map was disseminated to media outlets and educational institutions, an accompanying press release made it clear that, quote, a divided Germany means a divided Europe. The reunification of Germany in freedom will make a vital contribution to the stability of Europe and the peace of the world, end quote. Excluded from this press release, but embedded in a memo sent to the West German press office from the Roy Bernard Company, was an admission that this map is a public relations map. It is not intended for accurate geographical studies. But that never made it to any of the libraries or schools that use this map in education. The final map series I want to share with you today is another one produced by the Roy Bernard Company for West Germany. The maps I'm about to show you were proposed in 1952, and they accompanied an alternative and very dramatic narrative of the Second World War's end. The story reads, the enemy's armies approached the United States from the north in a broad front. The defenders lacked everything, losses increased, and the enemy was pitiless. Things came to an end. All states were occupied. The military and political leaders had fully surrendered. The victors met in Washington, D.C., and conferred about the future of a nation that lay crushed and powerless at their feet. This inventive history goes on, discussing this map, which shows how the United States was quartered into various fragments, one of which had been ceded to Mexico, and the other four existed under the occupation forces of the Soviet Union, South Africa, Canada, and weirdly, the entire continent of South America, which I think is interesting. You guys would have been in South America's zone. New Mexico would have been in Mexico. It goes on to explain how New York City and Washington, D.C. became divided into four sectors under Allied administration, and how U.S. place names were affected. Perhaps the most alarming was the changing of the name Seattle to Pacificrod. So ridiculous. Self-described as an illustration of the situation in Germany, transferred to the territory of the United States, this story sought to render to an American audience the unimaginable humiliation, alienation, and suffering experienced under the very real circumstances a new post-war West German government was attempting to cope with in 1952. Two versions of a potential map were submitted alongside this proposal. This first one leaves in place the boundaries of American states, while also making clear how the nation was divided. This second map erases the state boundaries, leaving only the labels and boundaries of occupied zones, and two dots meant to signify New York City and Washington, D.C. Note that New York over here has been renamed Four Power City. Clearly, none of our cartographic reference were safe from the geographic tyranny of our fictional foreign invaders. As far as I can tell, no publication came from this alternative rendering of the United States. The Roy Bernard Company's relationship with the Federal Republic came to a pretty abrupt end in 1961, and it had been kind of rocky from the early 1950s onward. What really started to create tension between, or I don't know about tension, what really started to make it difficult for the Roy Bernard Company to make West Germany seem awesome was the 1952 publication of Anne Frank's diary. That's a tough thing to put a positive spin on for the Germans. In 1960, there was an expose in an American magazine that publicized the role that Roy Bernard was playing in shaping American public opinion on behalf of the West German government. And what really broke the camel's back in 1961 was the Eichmann trial. There again, the West Germans really wanted Roy Bernard to be able to make that not a big deal in the United States, and that was just impossible. Roy Bernard could not do that for them. But I think that the work of Roy Bernard is an important example of how seriously the West German government and its American consultants took mapped space, just as seriously as the Allied military occupation had taken maps and cartography, and frankly, just as seriously as the Nazis had taken maps and cartography, as had, of course, the 19th and early 20th century German geographers before them. Maps, like any type of narrative or proposition, can be used to make arguments supporting good or bad politics, arguments advocating for racial diversity or for white supremacy, and arguments bolstering claims to territorial sovereignty or imperialist conquest and occupation. But to me, and I imagine to many of you, maps make those arguments in ways far more interesting and convincing than any other medium. The division of Germany after the Second World War was only undertaken, whether it was by government agencies, by educators, or by public relations firms, it was only undertaken with the understanding that maps were vital tools that could help shape a new post-war German national identity in ways that other texts just frankly could not. I think this kind of research makes that really clear and speaks to the continued value of controlling the creation and dissemination of map spaces. I'll end there. Thank you guys so much for your invitation and for your attention. Are there any questions? Oh, thank you.
Repeat the question so that people on Zoom land.
Sure. I don't know. You want to point at them? Do I point at them? Go ahead.
Was there any oversight by the government on educators for what they were allowed to be publishing in their materials?
Oh my goodness, yes. Not only, oh, sorry, I didn't remember that. She asked if there was any oversight over educators in post-war Germany and what they were allowed to publish or what they were allowed to do. And the answer is absolutely. In every occupied zone, not only did the United States send like a lot of money to help Germany recover after the Second World War, they also sent educators. And if you were going to be an educator in Germany after the war, you were, I don't want to say like intensely vetted, but they wanted people who were not members of the Nazi Party. They wanted people who, if they were members of the Nazi Party, seemed like opportunists. Maybe they joined later. Yeah, it was heavily regulated what could be published in those occupation zones because everybody realized that we want to turn sort of the goose-stepping Nazis into good, small d, democratic, like peace lovers. That was the program. So yeah, to answer your question, there was tons of oversight over education in those occupation zones. Yeah.
I wonder if you can say a few words about Saarland, because if I remember correctly, it was originally in the French zone, and it was released, the only area that really was given back to Germany.
Yeah, so Saarland is a weird space. It's weird because at different times, the Allies either determine that it's going to be an international zone or a French zone, and it goes back and forth like that a lot. I don't know a ton about the Saarland in particular for this period of time, but I do know that it was a contentious space insofar as the French wanted more influence over it because it was right on the border with Germany. And the Germans, of course, are going to want more influence over it as well because so many Germans lived there and they saw it as part of their national identity. But like a lot of these spaces, especially on the border, that's a pretty prickly subject. I know I'm not really answering your question. It's because I haven't looked extensively into that specific territory, but I know that it was contentious.
Yeah, I think they had a plebiscite.
A plebiscite, yeah, to vote on whether or not to join the site. Sorry, I didn't repeat the question again. I'll repeat the next one, I promise. Yeah.
The other countries that bordered Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, any of those have any influence on how the Allies broke up and declared their zone of influence?
So the question is, did Belgium or the Netherlands or other nation states around Germany have any influence over how the zones were created? No, frankly, no. The Americans, the Soviets, and the British in particular are going to say, we're the ones who defeated the Nazis. We're the ones whose armies are rolling into German territory. We're the ones who are going to get control of this territory. And the Soviets in particular, again, they are so obstinate in some of these negotiations because they have some moral leverage. They're going to say, look, the majority of people dying fighting Nazis are Soviet. The majority of ammunition or munitions being launched to the Nazis are Soviet munitions. We were fighting the Nazis before you were even in the war. You know, we should have a lot of space, a lot of leverage over what comes next. So just to be frank, like, no, they didn't really consider their positions at all. Yeah.
You know about that eastern part of Germany, the Silesian area and Western Prussian or Pomeranian area. Those obviously became part of, you know, the Soviet Union for a while, but they had previously been part of Germany for centuries, and yet after the war they were ceded to Poland. You know anything about the politics behind that or how that happened?
So the question is about the politics behind the giving up of Silesia and Pomerania to Poland after the war. Do you mean in the sense that the Soviets would have still wanted some control over it, or?
Yeah, why that was never reunified.
Oh, yeah. So why that was never unified with Germany? In part, it's because of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union, well, when World War I broke out, the Soviets a month earlier had split Poland, right, with the Nazis. They had said, or not a month earlier, I'm sorry. In August of 1939, right? Yeah, in August of 1939, the Soviets and the Nazis created this pact where they were going to split Poland. So when the Soviets help win the war, they're not given their half of Poland back. They're going to keep their half of Poland. The idea then was to give Poland some more territory back. And frankly, the Soviets wanted a pretty sizable Poland to serve as a buffer zone. Should there be another Nazi uprising that would encourage German expansionism? The Germans now were seen as being responsible for 2 world wars based on their vicious attempts to expand. So the Soviets were happy to kind of do that because it created a buffer between them and Germany. And frankly, the Soviets knew they'd have a ton of political influence over communist Poland. They knew they were going to have that influence. So it wasn't something that the Soviets weren't on board with, giving that to Poland. But again, the reason that they gave it to Poland was because the Soviets had eaten up a huge chunk of Poland. Good question. Sorry, yeah.
Matthew, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Am I going to read this or am I going to?
Why don't you just read?
Okay, so I'm going to read this question from the chat. It seemed to take many years to settle the mapping borders in the case of Germany. Is this time delay typical or not of other post-war mappings? For example, did the China boundaries take long to settle? That is a great question. I don't know about China, but I do know about Austria, for example, where the different occupational powers went into Austria and occupied different zones of that. That Austria was divided until 1955, technically, between occupational zones. So in that case, yeah, it does take time. The Allied powers are nervous about giving any kind of power back to a country that they defeated. And Austria was seen as like the first victim of Nazism. That's a country they all agreed would become sovereign again. And it still took them 10 years to give Austria really fully back its sovereignty. So yeah, in other instances that I'm aware of, it does take a long time for sovereignty to be given back to these countries and for these mapping problems to be resolved. Yeah, what?
I remember being in Berlin in Soviet times, and I remember the 4th powers and talk a little bit more, because I'm very naive about what France got out of it at the beginning in terms of its own boundaries. I mean, did it get Alsace-Lorraine in that correct? I don't know. And if you talk a little bit more about what they got in terms of France, that became part of France, and then also what influence they might have had beyond Berlin.
Yeah, so Wes asks about what happens really to France after the war when it comes to especially their boundary with Germany, what happens with France and Berlin. As far as Alsace-Lorraine, like, yeah, France gets to control that territory. France gets to pick up territory because it was seen as, again, one of these early victims of National Socialism. I think it's interesting that it's not surprising, but it's interesting that France is included in these talks because France did not contribute as much. Like they will say, of course, they contributed a lot to the defeat of the Nazis, which is fine and good, and they certainly contributed. But when we're talking about Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States, they far outsize the influence over defeating the Nazis and the French. But the French, in the negotiations that I've read, the French justify their position as saying, you know, we have fought the Germans before. We were their victims in World War I. We're their victims again in World War II. We want back Alsace-Lorraine, which had been a point of contention for since Germany became a country in 1871. The French want that territory back. And so, yeah, I guess to answer your question as best as I can, that's really all they get is a little bit of territory in the new defeated Germany. They get Alsace-Lorraine, and they get that little district in Berlin. And as I mentioned, FDR was not a fan of that. He did not think that France deserved to have that level of power in post-war Germany. But as far as I know, that's really all that France got from the end of the war. Yeah. Yeah.
What kind of collaboration and negotiations took place between the occupiers over the course of this time?
So the question is, what kind of collaboration took place between the occupiers? Do you mean during the war or after the war? After the war. So collaboration happens a lot between the British, the Americans, and the French. And eventually they create what they called the bi-zone and the tri-zone, where they're combining their different military occupational governments. Collaboration with the Soviets really doesn't happen after the war. They obviously speak to each other, but the Soviets are not interested in collaborating. It was the Soviets actually initially who were hoping for a reunified Germany. They were convinced that because communism had defeated fascism, well, the Germans would obviously become communists. They would see that communism was the way to go. And when elections in Western parts of Germany didn't play out that way, when communist parties started to lose to socialist parties, then you see the Soviet Union become less excited about potential reunification. But it's actually the Western zone that implements, for example, a currency to replace the Reichsmark, which was explicitly banned in negotiations during the war between all four powers. They had said, no one of us can create our own currency after the war. This has to be something we all agree on. But the West Zone just decides to do it in 1948 because they want to help Germany's economy recover. And I think that's one of the reasons you don't see more collaboration between the Soviets and the other Western powers. They have different visions for Germany. America, Britain, and France want Germany to recover because they want them to buy our stuff, right? The Marshall Plan is not humanitarian aid. The Marshall Plan is an investment in a potential trading partner. The communists don't want Germany to recover, especially right away after the war. Again, they've now fought Germany how many times in war? This was the worst war in Soviet history. They're not interested in that. They're taking factories back by rail into the Soviet Union. They're not interested in a German recovery. So those two fundamentally different visions for a future of Germany makes it really impossible for those sides to really work together after the war. It's a great question. Yeah.
After the war, is there any evidence or you have knowledge of the degree to which the Soviets started to just make fiction out of the Eastern German geography? Towns and lakes moving and
So the question is about the Soviets kind of when or how they start to sort of fictionalize the map of East Germany. And to be honest, I have pretty limited knowledge on that. When I talk about Germany after the war, when it comes to the East, I have a lot of limited knowledge because I don't read Russian. So I don't know a lot about what was going on there unless I have German sources. So no, I really can't speak to that in particular. I know that it happened to a certain extent, but I don't know to what extent or when that really became a thing. I can tell you from geography textbooks, there's only like one series for the Soviets. Again, in the West, you have all these different competing states with their different educational systems, and the Soviets have the one approved Marxist geography textbook. I can tell you that in that, they usually present East Germany as an island, and they just ignore the West and the rest of Europe. It's presented as either an island or you see the East and then Eastern Europe. Like that's all presented as a block, and the West just isn't on the map. So I can tell you that, but again, I don't know to what extent they started fictionalizing things in the East. Thank you. Okay, we'll do this and then that. Oh no, that's scary. It's a good one. Have you researched Russia's prime bombing location in Gallup that would cripple our transportation network? I've heard about that. I think there was something came out a while ago. There was some documentary that had the Soviets had like a map up on the wall, and Gallup was one of the places that they were planning on bombing. I've seen something about that, but I don't know too much about it other than just through like friends who've joked about it. Yeah, the great city of Gallup, if it ever got bombed, it would certainly cripple, it would close I-40, at least for a little while. But no, I don't know too much about that. That's a great question. I'll look into that. Yeah.
But can you talk a little about what happened in the 90s when all those Eastern sources started reuniting with the Western sources?
Like the source material itself?
Yeah, how map makers reacted to each other when the Iron Curtain came back.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is about, when Germany is reunified, when all of the hopes and dreams of these textbooks are realized, how did everybody react to it? What happened to the sources and the material? They shared sources. I mean, today, if you want to study this, you'd look at a lot of different research centers in the Leibniz Research Consortium, which is a different research consortium of lots of different German groups. Germany actually, academically, for the most part, handles that reunification pretty well. Now, there's some like cultural hiccups. I know East Germans weren't, this is kind of funny. Germany wanted to standardize all of its crosswalk signals. And the East Germans really loved their crosswalk signal. It had a little man in a hat who was walking, and it was being replaced by the Western one. And there were cries of imperialism about that because they really loved it. I think what's more interesting and telling is that world leaders at the time were not thrilled with German reunification. Mitterrand, right, from France, Margaret Thatcher, they did not love that Germany was reunifying because it was going to become, and it did, like the economic powerhouse of Europe after it reunified. So it wasn't something they were necessarily thrilled about. But as far as the source material, at least as far as I know, and the people who I've met who lived through that, it was not too difficult of a transition, in part because they had, over a year to really undertake it. And then after it happened, there were years of everybody kind of coming together and putting all their source materials together. Again, the biggest problem from the perspective of somebody trying to write about this is that you have to know Russian and German and English. And that's at least for me, a tall order. Russian can't do. Any other questions? Oh, to the Gallup one?
Yes.
Where is it?
Here.
Near the theater at Route 66, the Amoro Theater and the rail station. I could see, yeah, you know what? The rail that is a good point. That rail is, there are constantly trains on that rail. If that rail got blown up, it would mess up logistics in the United States. That is true. That is a good point. Yeah, it would shut off LA to Chicago. That's what it would shut off. So no, thank you. Sorry, I'll stop talking.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for that great talk. That just tells us that sometimes we listen to maps from the 16th century, 17th century. Mapping is still alive, and stay tuned for more things to happen in the world. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody on the Zoom land, and we'll see you next month for our next lecture. So have a good one.